Hi, I'm Caroline Levitt. I didn't see the live button. Sorry. I'm Caroline Levitt. I'm the co-founder of Mighty Blaze, the book initiative that was begun and the moment lockdown started. I co-founded it with Jenna Blum because we wanted to help authors whose tours were canceled, like me. We wanted to help bookstores whose doors were shuttered. We wanted to help authors. We wanted to help readers connect with authors. And now we're going on 4 years. It's amazing. We're a toddler. So I just have a few things to say before I introduce our guest, who I'm very excited about. If you have questions, put it in the chat. No question is like too weird to ask. Please ask it. We like our listeners to buy books from independent bookstores. I've made it really easy for you by telling you that you can order Splinters and all of Leslie's great books at bookshop.org. And the link is right up there, so you can go there and order as many books as you like. So today I'm really thrilled because I was telling Leslie before we got on that I first heard of Leslie Jamison. It must be over a decade ago when this wonderful publicist, Michael Takins, was my publicist at Algonquin Books. And he called me up and he said, I have this book you have to read. It's a debut and it's so great. And I think you would just love it. And I said, okay, send it to me. And it was Leslie Jamison's first novel, The Gym Game, and I did love it. And after I read it, I decided I was going to read everything that Leslie ever wrote. And I have, which brings us to her stunning new book, Splinters, which it's just phenomenal. It's absolutely phenomenal. It's about motherhood, art, teaching, everything else. And it's just, it's just the kind of book that has so much in it and so much weight and so much other stuff. So Leslie Jamison is the author of the New York Times bestsellers, The Recovering and The Empathy Exams, and the collection of essays with the greatest title ever, Make It Scream, Make It Burn, which was a finalist for the PEN Diamond Sign Spielvogel Award, and of course the novel that started it all for me, The Gym Closet. Did I say The Gym Game?
You did, but I'm loving imagining the other version of it.
I'm so sorry. That's a play. I'm sorry. I'm just so excited to talk to you that I screwed up. The Gym Closet, which you also can order at bookshop.org, which was a finalist for the LA Times Book Prize. She teaches at Columbia and she lives in Brooklyn. So Splinters is about becoming a mother just as your marriage is falling apart. It's about wrestling with art, and it's about finding yourself amidst all these losses. The praise is just rapturous. The New York Times said this is a beautiful, bittersweet memoir. Mary Carr said a blazing memoir and a forever classic. Maggie Smith said as sharp and piercing as its title. So thank you so much, Leslie, for being here. I'm just so thrilled and excited to have you here. Thank you, Sean. Thank you so much for writing such a wonderful book and so many wonderful, wonderful books.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And it's like a particular pleasure to speak to you, knowing that you've been reading, now for almost 15 years. And because I think it's true for your work or my work or any artist's work that there's a story that gets told across the arc of all of it, and you have been witnessing all along. So I feel excited and I feel honored and grateful to everybody who's here with us today. It's lovely to hear about the origins of this space as a way to kind of push back against pandemic isolation and so I'm just so thrilled. I'm happy to be here.
I'm thrilled you're here, and I want to talk a little bit because I saw an interview with you. I think it was on Brad Listy's wonderful podcast, Other People, where you were talking about how everybody expects writers to have a career almost like a nurse would have, or somebody as an executive, where you do good, you have good days, you have bad days, and you keep climbing the ladder. But when you're writing a book, you're only as good as your book that's out. And that's a really scary and humbling thing to think about, and that careers often go like well, at least my career goes like this, up and down, because you never know. And I loved it that you talked about that, because I think it's actually really soothing to a lot of writers to hear that. So thank you for saying that. So my first question is, your editor said that this was your most revealing work ever. Did that make you feel scared at all? You know, that level of revelation. And you've talked about often like being silent with your father because you didn't know if he'd find you interesting. Did you have that same sense in writing? Even though I want to assure everybody this is the most interesting book you will ever read.
um, what great places to begin, right in the deep end of the swimming pool, the only place I ever want to be. So thank you. I do think that there's a way that, you know, one of the things I'm writing about in this book is the different textures of love, the different textures of romantic love, the different textures of parental love. And I think one of the questions that one can ask about love, or one of the ways one can think about love on a continuum, right, is like, how contingent does it feel?
Right.
You have to earn it. And I'm, you know, thinking about kinds of love that are contingent in terms of, you know, the love that you might, you know, the conditionality of a marriage, or the ways that even certain kinds of parental love for me felt like, you know, I had to keep earning my father's attention, keep earning his approval. And in counterpoint, thinking about the kind of love that I want to give to my daughter, which is unconditional, which is I'm absolutely here. But I think it's certainly true that, like, part of what it means to grow up in the context of a love that feels like maybe it has to be earned is that it makes you develop your skills for earning it, right? So it's like to speak, to be a storyteller, to sort of perform myself. It's inseparable to me. The ways that I sort of express myself feel like they, of course, they owe so much to a childhood where I felt like I had to express myself well enough in order to be loved. But I think that's true for all of us, right? Like, our survival skills give birth to our gifts in these kind of complicated, fraught ways.
Exactly. There's a really interesting part of the book at the end where it's kind of juxtaposed with this beginning where you're afraid to say anything to your father because maybe it's not interesting, you haven't earned it. And at the very end, I think it's with the ex-philosopher. He asks you some question and you just say, no, and walk away. And then you have that moment of recognition. I did this. I can do this. I don't have to be a people pleaser. I don't have to earn that. I can just do that and walk away. And I thought that was an extraordinary moment. And I wanted to ask you, how are you showing or teaching your daughter that you don't have to earn things, that she can just be enough? Or do you think it's the human condition that none of us feel we're enough? Yeah. Unless we're very shallow.
Yeah, I love that question about kind of how essential or universal or inescapable is some feeling of lack. And I guess just to pull back for a second for people who haven't read or encountered the book, to give like a little bit of a lay of the land, and then I'll answer that fascinating question about my daughter. The book covers the first couple of years of my daughter's life. And the thing that I think I was most interested in, the origins of this book came from my fascination with the simultaneity of these two very intense falling in love with my daughter, raising her, building a life with her, just as my marriage was falling apart. So it was sort of like the dismantling of the life that I thought was on the horizon and the rebuilding of what came next. But also really this question of kind of like, how can one's days hold, how can even one's like physical self and body sort of hold grief and wonder at the same time, like a sense of loss and a sense of joy. And so I write about all the things you so eloquently mentioned. I write about mothering. I write about the dissolution of a marriage. I write about other forms of intimacy and sustenance that were really important to me in that time. Friendships as a kind of chosen family, my life as a teacher, and my relationships with my students as like sources of meaning and intimacy and caregiving. And so it's very much about sort of how does one piece together a self and a life when the structure of selfhood and life that you had thought was yours, had thought was your blueprint, had thought was your future is sort of falling apart. And within that, I think I'm constantly asking myself sort of how to give my daughter some sense of stability in the midst of all this instability. And there's a moment near the end of the book where the book closes with the two of us in kind of early pandemic lockdown in this like very intense
Right.
world where it's just the two of us. And I think about these endless hours that we're spending together that were at once beautiful and exhausting, right? But I start to think about my own boredom in some of those experiences as a gift that I'm giving her, right? Like to feel that she doesn't have to earn my presence, that I'll always be there. And I guess within that also to think that always being there doesn't actually mean we're never apart, because
Right.
important part of our bond that she's more than I am and that I'm more than she is, like that we have these lives that are more than just the other person, but to feel within even those moments of separateness that there's a love there that she can absolutely trust.
There's a wonderful line in the book where you're talking about, I want to be with my daughter all the time, but I also want to be with my laptop, writing and working. And I love that the way you were talking about the intersection of art and childbirth, because when I decided to have a child, all of my writer friends said, you're not going to forget being a writer with a baby. And I kept saying, no, it's going to work. It's going to work. And a few writers said, no, it'll deepen it. And I can remember keeping the bassinet at my side where Max would sleep for 2 hours and I would write. Then he'd wake up and I'd play with him for 2 hours. It was back and forth and back and forth. And I actually found that intensified both experiences for me, that if I had to be with a baby full time every single second, it wouldn't have deepened my writing. And if I just focused on my writing, it would be a disaster to my child. So in that vein, I wanted to ask you, did you find that, since loss and joy seem to be traveling parallel paths with you, that the joy made the loss more intense, and in that way it made it more bearable in some ways, or that experiencing the pain made the joy more intense?
Yeah, I love that question. It makes me think about Rumi, the poetry, and how he says that suffering essentially carves the space that joy can occupy in you, almost like the way that ocean carves a cave in the rock, right? And that the larger the cave, the more space there is for water to fill it. And I certainly think there's a way that pain and joy are feeding off of each other and deepening each other in this book. And, an example of that very early on is this moment where I'm sort of just delighted and amused and just witnessing just my daughter fiercely playing this rainbow xylophone, just like go almost like with her tiny little hands, and have a moment where I sort of turn to like witness it together with my partner, and then of course realize he's not
right
there.
right.
And the moment of sort of turning to the phantom partner gives rise to this early explicit statement of a question, like, would every moment of our happiness feel have this weight tucked inside of it? And I think it, I don't want to give an emotional spoiler alert, but I think in a way the answer is yes. But you can live with shadows, and you can live with happiness. And later in the book, I start to think maybe being haunted was its own form of abundance. Like maybe to have sort of shadows stippling all of these moments of pleasure is actually an enriching, a kind of a deepening force as well. So I think there's absolutely a way that like moments of joy sort of verge over or deepen or sharpen moments of loss. But then I also think there's a way that loss and instability and bewilderment and not knowing what's happening next, like all of these feelings in the book, me hungry. They make me hungry for experience. They make me hungry for beauty. They make me hungry for art as a source of sustenance. They make me hungry for intimacy with other people, with my friends. They make me hungry for like long nights of eating and laughing and drinking seltzer because I haven't had booze in 13 years. They make me, so there's a way that desire, a sort of really feral desire for experience, is absolutely, that appetite is whetted by a certain kind of loss.
There was also this lovely thing about there was a story arc of your marriage where, it started out great and then there was a lot of anger. And what was so fascinating is that by the end of the book, you had another great line about you felt like you had left your ex, but you were still offering him a plate of cookies, where you had sort of an amicable relationship towards the end. And I, in my first marriage, it was when I left my marriage, I thought I would never see my first husband again. Like, that was it. And now we're friends. And there's something very strange and wonderful about that. And I was wondering if you felt the same thing, because you're still co-parenting your daughter, right?
Mhm.
I mean, do you still feel like, I mean, it's like it's a different version of what it was. The first version where you were married, then there was the version where you were divorced. And now, is there a different version?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I think, in a way, the relationship that comes to mind when you ask that question is not my own, but my parents, which became one of the kind of deep histories in this book. And I would be so curious to hear you talk about this experience with your own books, Caroline. But I find that with every project I work on, there are, of course, some things that feel like intentions and desires with that project.
Right.
There are the things I know it's about. With this book, I knew it was about rebuilding this life in the aftermath of my marriage. I knew it was about art and motherhood. I knew it was about kind of like feeling hungry again after my life fell apart. I knew all those things, but I didn't know the ways in which the book was actually going to reach back and look a little bit deeper than it
It's so interesting.
and kind of look back to like, where did I get these ideas about what mothering looked like? Where did I get these ideas about what marriage looked like? Where did I even get these ideas about what divorce might look like? Because my parents have a version of what you're describing, which is to say their relationship didn't end when their marriage ended.
Right.
It shifted, almost like turning from like a liquid to a gas, or a gas into a solid.
Right. It did.
It found a new version of itself in the aftermath.
That's like totally extraordinary. I also want to talk about the relationship with your mother, which I thought was kind of extraordinary too, because she loved you so much and she loved your baby and she was kind of a model to you. And yet in your marriage, your ex said that you and your mother and the baby formed a closed unit against him, which led to the relationship rupture. I was really curious if you thought, was this true? Was this true at the time? Did you feel that you were forming a closed unit, or were you just doing the best you could? And what would your mother say about this? Or has she said something about
you might have to ask her onto the show. But yeah, I mean, I think what I can absolutely say is true, which I think opens up a really interesting conversation that I love having about memoir and personal narrative. I think what's often true about experience is that it feels very different ways to the different people involved. So
right, exactly.
In a sense, both sides of what you're asking are true. It is true that it felt that way to him, and it's true that it felt to me like I was doing the best that I could. And I think with memoir, of course, you're always writing your own subjectivity. You're writing your own perspective. I think the deal that is made between, or the understanding maybe that always implicitly exists between a reader and a writer when it comes to memoirs, like, this is not everybody's side of the story. This is art. This is art made from a subjectivity and made from the materials of a life. But I think even within that sort of implicit understanding that, like, I'm not, in a way, it would be arrogant to somehow pretend like I was speaking for everybody's point of view, because I'm not. I'm speaking from my own I, this creature constructed on the page. But at the same time, I do think that one of the ways that memoir can become more powerful, or one of the aspirations I had for my own memoir, is to give these moments where I'm letting other people speak inside the text. And sometimes what they are saying is pushing back against how my own subjectivity has been experiencing something. So there's that moment where the character of Mike's husband on the page talks about feeling shut out. And that's a moment where, again, it's not that the whole narrative becomes his, but it's a moment where I'm dramatizing a kind of a powerful moment in experience where you're understanding that what you felt, the same set of events that you felt one way, another person might have felt them an entirely different way. And I think when you can show those little moments of rupture in a narrative, those moments of sometimes moments of wrongness, sometimes moments of just understanding the kind of like radical simultaneity of different experiences of reality. I think those are where you let the narrative become that much more human and that much more textured and that much more alive. So absolutely, I'm conscious of using other people's voices in that way inside the text to sort of push back against the closed or the limited scope of my own understanding.
Right. And you also have to deal with what the reader's bringing to the table. I mean, I think that somebody who was a mother who had gone through a divorce would read this book very differently than somebody who said, no, I'm never going to have kids. I don't want kids, which is fine. But that would be a different perspective altogether. I wanted to ask, yes, you talked about a conscious decision rather than a surrender in terms of love. And I snagged on that sentence and I thought, that's really interesting. So please, would you talk about that?
Yeah, this is actually a moment where I think there are some real subterranean tunnels between different books, between sort of different moments in my career. So this moment is a moment where I'm talking about kind of the urge, some of what I brought into the experience of marriage itself, which was not only a deep and real love for my ex-husband, but was also a desire to kind of have a certain kind of solidity and irrevocability in my own actions, to do things that I couldn't take back, to speak frankly, to feel the texture of commitment as one of the structuring forces of my life. And that starts to speak to kind of intention and decision rather than just feeling like one surrenders to feeling. And I think whenever we make promises to each other as human beings, whether it's the promise of partnership or the promise of parenting or even the promises of friendship, I think part of what we're promising is to be engaged in a dynamic that is more than the sum of our feelings at any particular moment, to not just be in something because in that particular moment you feel like it, but to sort of make a commitment that transcends and overrides just that moment by moment experience, to commit to something bigger in a way than just like how you feel at any given moment in time. So I'm really thinking about that as like part of the energy that was taking me into marriage, was like feeling to be a decision, not just a surrender. But it's also very connected to some of the thinking that I was doing 10 years ago in the opening essay of the empathy exams, the essay also called the empathy exams, that is really, it's a dissection of empathy that uses a few of my own experiences, a heart surgery, an abortion, a relationship, to think about, what is empathy? What does it mean to even imagine inside somebody else's consciousness, or to think what you feel, but is really interested in feeling that's kind of pushing back against this romantic idea of feeling as just like a passion swelling, and thinking like, yeah, how we feel is also related to our willpower. Like we're not entirely without agency when it comes to what we feel and how we relate to what we feel.
You also said another really extraordinarily interesting thing where you were talking about the space inside of you, which I think everybody feels that something's missing. And you tried to fill it with booze, and now you're sober, eating disorder, and now that's okay. And do you think that space ever goes away? And do you think that all creative people grapple with that, and that writing is a way to fill that space?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that I think that inside of everyone there is some sense of lack, or I should say it more like this. I have never met a person who doesn't have some feeling of wanting something outside of themselves. But I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't think humans were meant to be entirely autonomous, self-reliant creatures. I think to need love and care from other human beings, to need something bigger than the self, whether you call it divinity or just like the company of others, to need mystery, to need change, to need beauty, like to feel like that one isn't just enough, I think is like to be alive, like to be in motion, to be engaged with the world. So I don't think lack is necessarily a bad thing in the way that we sometimes can in a knee-jerk sense, understand it to be. That said, I think there's a kind of feeling of a bottomless pit inside that isn't necessarily distributed across people or experienced the same way by everyone. And, and there are lots of different ways you can try to fill it. And I feel like I've tried a bunch of them, like, and love and eating and not eating and mothering and, but absolutely, I think art is probably one of the most generative ways that I've tried to kind of respond to this feeling of sort of shadow or mystery.
Right.
And sometimes it does feel like a bottomless pit, and that feels panic inducing and kind of endless and maybe even unsolvable. But sometimes it feels more like a kind of an unsolved, not entirely explicable, mysterious thing inside that's like a source of it can be a source of energy too.
Yeah, I just, there's a lot of feel good gurus around, and whenever anybody says, you're supposed to say to yourself, I'm enough just the way I am. And whenever I hear that, I think, really? You get to feel that? But I also feel that, if you do feel that you're enough, it doesn't allow the growth space. It doesn't allow you to change and find something better. I wanted to talk about the language of this memoir. I wrote down one of the things you said. I just felt your language was so fresh and surprising. You said falling in love with C, who was your ex, was like ripping hunks from a loaf of fresh bread and stuffing them in my mouth. That's a perfect image for falling in love. It's because it's like grabbing all the senses. So I want you to know, when you write, are you conscious of the language, or does that come later, or does it just come out onto the page and then you finesse it? How does that work for you?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely have a very intuitive drafting process. So for me, like, a book is all about its language. Like, there's no part of me that is interested in narrating the events of my life for their own sake. It's all about, in a way, kind of digging deep into my own experience in order to use language in ways that I've never used it before, in order to explore consciousness in ways that I've never explored it before. So the voice of the text is like totally inseparable from writing the text at all. And often when kind of metaphoric language comes into it, it's that sort of satisfying feeling of trying to crystallize into language a thing one has sort of invisibly felt for one's entire life. And like the experience of falling in love, which is sort of like ravenous, hungry, sometimes makes you feel like you're starving, sometimes makes you feel like you're full. And so then you can sometimes find, oh yeah, it's like grabbing at things and stuffing them in your mouth. And that, and that image can hold the feeling better than abstraction can, when and how, like, metaphor becomes useful. So there's definitely something intuitive about drafting. And with this book, like, it wasn't just the voice of the language, it was also really the form that felt inextricable from the project from the very beginning. So the form is like these very sharp, whittled, distilled
Splinters.
Splinters. Yeah, absolutely. The title of the book does refer to its emotional landscape, like what are these kind of painful experiences that lodge under the skin and become part of you, but it's also truly about the form of the book. I really think of this book as built of these splinters of prose. And so that unit size was like, I couldn't have written this book without knowing that one of its primary rhythms was like the rhythm of the splinter in that way. But then, there's an intuitive drafting process, but then I revise work so many times. And it's in that process of revision that I'm really trying to get to more precise, layered, and complex emotional articulations, where maybe I named one of my motivations in the first draft, but by the third draft, I want to be able to name like 3 of my motivations. I want to be able to be like, yes, I was, I was falling in love, but also I was like reacting against the relationship I had been in before. And also I kind of hated this fickle part of myself and I wanted to kill that part of myself, so it's to be able to sort of not necessarily turn on what happened in the first draft and say, no, that wasn't right at all, but to say, yes, maybe that's right, but also what more is like lurking here that I wasn't ready to see in the first draft, but when I go back and really bear down and dig deep, what can I see the second time around, the third time around, the fourth time around?
You also wrote about the stories everyone is writing about their lives, like the tumbleweed you dated. If it's not too personal, I wanted to know, what is the story of your life that you're writing now? If it's too personal, you could just say it's too personal. Shut up.
No, I mean, I think I'm in a much more stable place in my life right now. I'm in a partnership. My daughter is 6, and she is both the same creature that she is in these pages in terms of her curiosity and her wit and her like vibrant imagination, but also, she's 3 times as old, so she has that much more language, much more agency, and feeling so big she doesn't quite even know how to hold them in her body. I mean, my life feels like it holds so much richness. My own writing right now is maybe pointed away a little bit more away from my life than it's been in the past. I'm working on a novel.
Oh, great! I was going to ask you.
It's like it actually starts like deep in the past. It tells the story of the Minotaur's mother. So in that sense, it's like it's mythic and exists in a different register than anything I've ever written. But as with so much fiction, the sort of like the further you go, there you are. So it's about the Minotaur's mother, but it's absolutely about kind of parenting and sacrifice and culpability and, ordering from Amazon. I mean, sort of like we fling ourselves away when we imagine, but we find all of our same familiar demons waiting there.
Oh, I'm so happy to hear that, because there was such a long time between the gin. I mean, there wasn't another novel after the gin game, and I thought, oh, I hope you didn't decide not to write novels anymore. Your memoirs are wonderful, but I can't wait to read that. That's incredible. So I want to ask you about your class, because you're teaching at Columbia. What do you learn from your students? I mean, what surprised you the most about them?
God, I'm learning all the time from my students. And I think one of the things that I was really committed to in Splinters was documenting a few parts of, or I guess writing into the texture of a few parts of my life that hadn't shown up in my work very much before. And those were friendship and teaching, my life with my students, the parts of me that come out when I teach, whether that's in terms of sort of caregiving or craftsmanship, and also the ways in which I honestly feel like a perpetual student of my students. And there's one level that's like true in terms of what they, my students are nonfiction students. I teach in the MFA program at Columbia. So my students are graduate students. Many of them are in their 20s. Some of them are even older. They're working on all different kinds of nonfiction. They're working on personal essays. They're working on literary reportage. They're working on criticism. So they're teaching me about the world, often in the content of their work. They're teaching me about their own lives,
Right.
backgrounds they come from. They're teaching me about other people's lives when they're doing reportage. I had a competitive skier who wrote about being caught in an avalanche. I have, a student who wrote about Nigerian love scammers and his mother's relationship with one of them. So I'm kind of constantly learning about the world from my students, but I'm also watching and kind of helping them in their wrestling with so many of the same things that I'm wrestling with as a writer, right? How do I build myself as a character on the page? How do I kind of look past the most ready to hand, easiest versions of the stories that I tell myself about my own life? How do I build a scene that both illuminates the point that I'm trying to make and complicates that point and surprises me as a writer and surprises a reader, like all of these. So in that sense, I'm also learning from kind of witnessing my students and their own craft struggles. In addition to I almost think of them sometimes as like explorers or ambassadors who have ventured out into all of these corners of the world. And then I get these dispatches back from them in the form of their exercises and their essays.
We have a comment from Robin Stull who says, hello. She's just waving to you, or he's just waving to you, or they're just waving to you. Ollie told me we have a question from the audience. Oh, what life advice would you give to your younger self? Does this differ from the advice you would like to give your daughter? Oh, that's an interesting question.
Yeah, I love that question. Yeah, I mean, I think, I honestly, I think that one of the ways I think about what kind of advice I would like to give to my daughter is kind of what do I wish I had known when I was younger. So in that sense, those questions do feel really beautifully connected to me. I think um, I think one of the things that I would love to tell my younger self is something that I actually heard like in a church basement in Iowa City many years ago. Somebody said, things don't always get better, but they always get different. And that was a beautiful kind of twist on a kind of truism that I think we've all heard, but probably nobody believes because it's just not true. Things don't always get better. They actually sometimes get much, much harder. Or they
I
certainly
know.
don't get better on the timelines that we're demanding that they get better on. But they do actually always change. It was a kind of hope that I could believe in. And I think a younger version of me, and still, to be perfectly frank, sometimes this version of me, but absolutely with even more ferocity and kind of impenetrability, a younger version of me felt like whatever was happening in the present moment was forever. It was so hard to see a way around it or a way past it or a way out of it. So I think I would want my daughter to feel what I would also want my younger self to feel, which is also advice that I need to give my present day self sometimes too, which is like things don't always get better, but they always get different. And also what this particular moment holds or how this particular moment feels is not how it's always going to feel.
Right. That's really important. As an obsessive person myself, I always ask writers, what's obsessing you now and why?
I'm obsessed. One thing that I'm obsessed with, and I think I've been obsessed with it for a long time, but I'm really thinking about it with new intensity right now, is daydreaming. I don't know what your daydreaming life is like, Caroline, but I'm really interested in daydreams as this sort of unspoken shaping force in our days. Like people spend, the research on daydreaming is that people spend between a quarter and maybe half of their waking hours engaged in some
Wow.
like the mind drifting or it means different things to different people. The mind imagining alternate versions of your life or versions of the future, other relationships, other vocations, other homes, and thinking about it, but it often feels even more private than the things we do. Like I think the things we imagine sometimes feel even more unspeakable than it's almost like our daydreams are our deepest secret. So I'm really interested in kind of what do our daydreams tell us about our own desires. It's part of a kind of a larger project that I'm thinking about, but it's also become I'm working on a book about daydreaming, but it's also become somewhere I go in conversations. It's really interesting to see how different people respond to that question. Some people sort of insist, I don't really daydream at all. Some people feel like they've been waiting their entire lives to be asked that question.
What about daydreaming as compared to night dreaming? How are they different for you? Do you think there's more of a choice in daydreaming where nighttime dreaming is more like your brain churning up things you need to pay attention to?
Yeah, I think I think there's I think that there's certainly a relationship. I think both of them have to do with like things that are getting processed deep in the self and deep in the psyche.
Right.
They're either showing up as maybe fantasies, as anxiety fantasies, sort of like what I think of as like dark daydreams of like ways things might go wrong, or they're showing up in sometimes very surreal landscapes of our nighttime dreams, sometimes very banal landscapes of our, the dream about losing the keys. And then I think, oh my God, can't my subconscious come up with anything interesting than this? But one of the differences I'm interested in is I think we kind of have to I feel like I have to own my daydreams a little bit more than my dreams. My night dreams feel like my subconscious was up to something, and almost like things I did in a blackout when I used to drink. Like I can't, it wasn't me, like I feel like I have to, there's a little bit more intentionality there. So I have to kind of claim it. And that claiming, what can feel either liberating or exhilarating or a little shameful about that claiming, is part of what interests me as well.
Okay. I want to tell everybody who showed up here, thank you so much for coming to Friday Frontliner. Look at this gorgeous cover. I'm afraid it's showing upside down, but it does say Splinters on it. It's a wonderful book. It's a terrific book. And don't forget, I gave you the link, so you can all all you have to do is click on it, and you can buy this book and every single other book of Leslie's very, very easily. Thank you for all the questions. Thank you for everything. And we'll see you at Friday Frontliner next week, I guess. And I want to thank Leslie so much for being here and for writing this wonderful book and for all those wonderful, wonderful questions. Oh, and I just want to tell everybody, don't forget, you can watch, if you missed this, you can still watch it on YouTube. You can tell all your friends to go to a Mighty Blaze YouTube station, and you can watch it as many times as you want. So thank you all, and we'll see you at Friday Frontliner very soon.